How you doing? I'm Roger Sherman, coming to you from Rosa Parks' room inside of the O Street mansion. This is my producer, Jerry Cotto.
How y'all doing?
Normally, I like to talk about some fun stuff here. We talk about food, we talk about barbecue, we have different guests on. But we're standing inside of Rosa Parks' room in the O Street mansion, and we thought it was probably a good time to at least address some of the things that are going on here in Washington, D.C. and nationwide. A couple of days ago, a bunch of individuals stormed the nation's capital, took over the Capitol building in protest to an election, a fair election that happened a couple of months ago. Everybody in the nation remembers a couple of months back over the summer, there was some protests in Washington, D.C., where there were peaceful protests for Black Lives Matter. The National Guards were brought out, tear gas was thrown out, people were arrested. Very different situation this past week here in Washington, D.C., where there was no National Guard initially, there was no tear gas initially, there were no photo ops in front of buildings with Bibles turned upside down, and we just kind of wanted to address that. So I know I've got a lot of thoughts about what's happening here. I live 30 blocks away from the Capitol. I'm black, that's obvious. Jerry, what do you think? What are you thinking today?
I have such complex views just in general on racism. There's so much stuff I see that was implemented hundreds of years ago that still exists that's pretty unique to the American public. We've been hurt and taken advantage of for so long that, appropriation and appreciation get really, like, where does the line start and where does it stop? And then you have things like this, and there were nooses that were hung. There were
behind the Capitol building,
walking around. There was Nazi memorabilia. There were swastikas seen on people, and these aren't made up or taken from the internet. You and I are both locals. These are firsthand, police officers, whatever, individuals that we know that were there on the ground. Camera footage that has been reviewed. It's not made up, and people want to speak as if it's the exception. It's not. Racism is alive and well in 2020, unfortunately.
The difference is there isn't more or less racism right now in the world. There's just more cameras.
Yes.
So you're seeing it a lot more often, and a lot more people are a lot more emboldened, especially over the course of the last 4 years. Look, we'll just be honest and put it out there. The President of the United States, puts out a lot of verbal hatred. He puts it out there through his Twitters. He rallies his base. He incites feelings in people. He rallies people to go and do certain things. Let's put it out there and make sure that it's very clear that there was a rally in front of the White House where he instructed people to go down to the Capitol building. His lawyer, Giuliani, said we needed to have trial by combat. You can say these things, but if you do, expect certain things to happen.
Now, here's a really fun part of that. For all the individuals that want to say, well, he said be peaceful, and sure, he let a few tweets go in a quick video where he said be peaceful. Do you know what he was doing while the riots were happening?
Probably watching the riots happen.
He literally had a watch party. The video is online. If you haven't seen it, you can watch it. These areas, you need clearances to get through them.
Yes, this is trespassing. This is vandalism.
Trespassing, vandalism, and then being there without the proper clearances, all of these things, it's insane that it could even happen.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen by accident. D.C. is a very secure city. Again,
Washington, D.C., I've lived here most of my life. I'm from here. If there's anything that Washington, D.C. knows how to do, it's how to stop a protest. This was not accidental. You cannot breach the Capitol building unless people are going to let it happen. We have a National Guard. People knew the protest was going to happen. People knew that there was an opportunity that the protests might get violent, and yet nobody did anything about it. There was no preparation for this.
There were briefs heading into the protest. There were plenty of threats. Plenty of protesters stated what they were going to do.
Everybody in the hood knew what was going to happen.
There was no secret. If this surprised you, you've been willfully blind or just not,
You're not paying attention.
you know.
It's the thing that I have to think about sometimes is, yes, slavery started 400 years ago, and we could go all the way back to that level of racism. You got to remember that the civil rights movement happened during my parents' lifetime. That's one generation beyond me. It's not that new. So sometimes I have to remind myself that the changes out there are relatively recent, but you want to believe that change has actually come, but then you see things like have happened over the last 4 years. You see things that happened on earlier this week down at the Capitol building. You saw the juxtaposition to that on the things that happened during the Black Lives Matter protest.
That was absurd.
And you just realize that nothing has changed in the last 60 years. Nothing has really changed in the last 100 years. And it's more disheartening than I'd like to admit. Yes, there's been an election. We have a new president coming. Please don't get lulled into thinking that things are going to change overnight. Please do not believe that when Joe Biden is inaugurated on January 20th, that by January 21st, things are going to change. I do not believe in magic. 2020 was an awful year. I did not expect at midnight on January 1st for things to change. We're going to have to put some effort in. We're going to have to do some things. We're going to have to excite change. We're going to have to, be emboldened about it and go after these things. So, I didn't want to go on forever about this, but I thought it was important for us to address this, especially since we're standing in a historic room here where Rosa Parks lived for for a significant period of time. But I did want to address some of these things.
As Americans, one thing that, and it goes to your point, things aren't going to magically change. We have work. We can't assume that our views on either side, I hate to admit it, even though I feel like our side is more just.
Sure.
But we can't say that we can't be stuck in our views. At some point, we have to reevaluate things. Now,
here's the last thing I'll say, and I'll get us out of here on this one. If you expect everybody to change, or if you expect anybody to change, you are simply fooling yourself. There are people out there who feel certain ways, whether they be on one side of the issue or the other,
yes,
that are simply not going to change. That's fine, but we need to understand where the line is drawn. This is my last point. It is very simple. My freedom ends where Jerry's nose begins. I cannot take my freedoms past that point. And if we can all do that, regardless of whether or not we get along, or even if we hate each other, if I stop my freedoms where his nose begins, we can coexist. And that's all we're looking for at this point, is to be able to coexist. That's all I got.